I'm going to read this section from this journal article I just published on panpsychism and its relevance to the study of consciousness in neuroscience and the philosophy of mind. I'm going to read the section on emergentism and offer it specifically to David Long, who's been posting some videos about integral theory and idealism versus realism and materialism and emergentism as an explanation of consciousness. So I'm going to read just this section. Emergentism claims that consciousness suddenly appears in the universe whenever matter manages to arrange itself into the appropriate dynamical shapes. Some say a simple form of consciousness emerged with the first living cells. We could call this biopsychism. While others claim that these cells had to blindly organize themselves into larger packs of neurons called brains before the light of consciousness could flicker on. We could call this cerebropsychism. Still others insist that it was necessary for these brains to become sufficiently entangled in the symbolic network of a language before full-blown consciousness could explode onto the scene. And we could call this anthropopsychism. There are weak and strong versions of emergence. The higher level capacities of a weakly emergent consciousness are at least in principle deducible from, and thus in fact causally reducible to, its lower level constituents. Once cognitive neuroscience discovers the relevant underlying brain mechanisms, complicated as they may be, the mystery of consciousness will be understood to have been only an artifact of our limited knowledge. Weak emergence, the idea of the weak emergence of consciousness from its material basis, thus presents an epistemological puzzle for physicalism to solve, rather than an ontological impasse, forcing it to re-examine its premises. Of course, if weak emergentists do solve the engineering problem of how the brain makes the mind, it is difficult to see how they will avoid sliding back into epiphenomenalism, which is another position I discuss in this paper. In other words, a weakly emergent conception of consciousness, or a view of consciousness as weakly emergent from brain processes, would be basically the same as an epiphenomenalist position, because it's sort of a ghost in the machine, a mere appearance of qualia with no effect upon the way that the brain machine operates. So weak emergence actually just becomes a species of epiphenomenalism, in other words. So strongly emergent conceptions, in contrast to weakly emergent conceptions of consciousness, affirm the ontological novelty of consciousness above and beyond its physical components, even granting it downward causal influence upon the body and surrounding environment. So consciousness, conceived of as strongly emergent, has causative influence over the body, right? It's not just epiphenomenal. So such a view refuses, at least, to explain away the evident facts and overpowering deliverances of conscious thought and intention. Facts that law, politics, morality, religion, and everyday life in general presuppose and require. Facts even that the endeavor to produce scientific knowledge itself necessarily presupposes. For what else is knowledge but a mode of consciousness? As Whitehead quipped, I quote, "Scientists animated by the purpose of proving that they are purposeless constitute an interesting subject for study. But unless it can explain how meaning and purpose arise out of mass and energy, strong emergentism lands us right back where Descartes left us nearly 4 centuries ago, with irreducible mind on one side, brute matter on the other, and no rational account of how they might relate to one another. Focusing on the gradual development of mental capacities from bacterial chemotaxis to Shakespearean poetry, like there's a developmental process from bacteria swimming up glucose gradients to the dramas of Hamlet's inner life. And these developmental processes unfold over the course of billions of years of biological evolution. And to focus on this, it's a great strategy to narrow the gap between mind on one side and matter on the other. But merely saying, as an emergentist, that evolution did it, that evolution gave rise to consciousness, doesn't cut it, since it wasn't Darwinian evolution that gave rise to cellular life. Darwin's theory of speciation by natural selection presupposes self-producing and reproducing organisms, autopoietic beings, in other words. It does not explain these. It presupposes them. In Evan Thompson's words, I quote, "Natural selection is an emergent consequence of autopoiesis, not its cause." So you can't say evolution did it unless you have a more robust theory of evolution than just Darwinian natural selection. On the other hand, there is a wider definition of evolution than that assigned by Darwin. Whitehead was convinced that evolution had relevance not just for biology, but for all the sciences, including physics and cosmology. He imaginatively generalized Darwin's theory such that the evolution by the reproductive inheritance of variation, checked by environmental pressure, became evolution by the rhythmic propagation or vibratory reiteration of actual occasions along historical routes, whereby a particular occasion's conformal physical prehensions of past actualities or inheritance of efficient causes are integrated with its novel conceptual prehensions of future possibilities, which are the formal causes of variation, integrated into some emergent, enduring pattern of experiential value. And I know that's a mouthful, and understanding it requires having read a little bit of Whitehead. But Whitehead's argument is that materialism could not survive its encounter with evolutionary theory, since the former materialism implies merely the purposeless and unprogressive rearrangement of externally related substances and their accidental properties, while the whole point, this is Whitehead, quote, "the whole point of the modern doctrine is the evolution of the complex organisms from antecedent states of less complex organisms," end quote. Whitehead continues, "The doctrine cries aloud for a conception of organism as fundamental for nature." So information theoretic accounts of the gap between matter and life provide some hope for a pathway forward, but without incarnating information into the meaningful horizon of experience enacted by living organisms, research programs seeking to analogize brain activity to computation end up having to conceive of information processing as some sort of quasi-conscious homunculus hovering above the neurochemistry of the brain and steering it around. For example, neuroscientists regularly describe information processing in the brain as, quote, goal-relevant, quote, selective, and, quote, sensitive. All terms implying intentionality and purposefulness, even though the presuppositions of mechanistic biology and neuroscience, upon which these computational paradigms are being erected, even though those presuppositions rest upon saying that such powers, purpose, intent are impossible. Luckily, taking information seriously does not require, and I quote Terence Deacon, assuming that abstract properties have physical potency. Deacon is a strong emergentist who tries to dispel the homunculus and de-etherealize information by describing it not as an extra essence added to the physical, but in terms of the absential, his word, absential features of an incomplete nature. I quote Deacon, "A counterintuitive figure background reversal, focusing on what is absent rather than present, offers a means to repair some of the serious inadequacies in our conceptions of matter, order, life, work, information, representation, and even consciousness and conceptions of value." End quote. That's from Deacon's book, Incomplete Nature. Information is just what is absent from physically present matter. It is not involved in the push and pull of causal efficacy, but instead constrains these physical interactions, acting as a formal and final cause that ratchets physics and thermodynamics up a contragrade organizational gradient into chemistry or morphodynamics, and then biology or teleodynamics, and eventually full-blown conscious thought or intentionality. Like the inactivists, like Evan Thompson, Deacon limits information processing to the living world, denying intentionality to the physical and chemical realms. He grants morphodynamic systems the ability to, quote, fall up negentropic gradients of complexity toward the telic informational processes of living semiosis, but he rejects the idea of any aim or value or élan vital implanted in matter prior to the emergence of life. Telos is added later and not baked in. Not the creative evolution of organisms, but vacuous bits of matter with no internal values, hurrying through space, right, are fundamental for nature if Deacon is right. So it is here that the panpsychist integration of physics and experience goes further toward the naturalization of information by making sign interpretation or semiosis, or in Whitehead's terms, prehension, an intrinsic part of cosmogenesis from the get-go, an intrinsic part of physical process from the get-go. Deacon criticizes Whitehead for projecting, quote, micro homunculi down to the level of quantum events, arguing that Whitehead's pan-experientialism obfuscates the need for an explanation of, quote, why the characteristics of physical processes associated with life and mind differ so radically from those associated with the rest of physics and chemistry, end quote. Deacon admits that Whitehead in fact does offer an explanation for these differences in terms of the organizational complexity of enduring societies, in Whitehead's terms, of actual occasions of experience that emerge in the course of evolution. I quote Deacon, "Yet, if specific organizational complexity is what matters, then little explanatory significance is added by the assumption that some level of micro-intentionality was suffused throughout all the component processes." End quote. While Deacon's approach succeeds in narrowing the distance between physical causality and conscious intentionality, an explanatory gap still remains. Whitehead's wager is that this gap is extreme enough to require fully undoing modern science's bifurcation of nature, Whitehead's phrase. Undoing this bifurcation by affirming that feeling or prehension is as intrinsic to natural processes as causality. Indeed, Whitehead's experiential concept of prehension is meant to account for the very possibility of causal relation as such. Prehension is what allows the real potentiality of the objectified past to pass into the subjective immediacy of a new actual occasion of experience. Prehension is akin to the information processing of computationalists, only it avoids the vagaries of their epiphenomenalism by rendering the detection of form as a process of feeling, thus embodying information in an experiential horizon. While his philosophy of organism does grant some degree of mentality to even the simplest of actual occasions, Whitehead's pan-experientialism doesn't add anything extra to the natural world we find ourselves within. I quote Whitehead, The operation of mentality is primarily to be conceived as a diversion of the flow of energy. End quote. In other words, mentality is an absential constraint upon energy's otherwise entropic tendencies. Were this entropic tendency the final word in nature's becoming, we would not be here to regret the fact. Whitehead is thus attempting to render the true nature of the physical universe transparent to us as the ongoing aesthetic achievement of a vast nexus of experiential occasions. I quote Whitehead, "These unities of existence, these occasions of experience, are the really real things which in their collective unity compose the evolving universe, ever plunging into the creative advance." End quote. So quarks, photons, protons, electrons, neutrons, and the like appear to be our most ancient ancestors. They are what Whitehead calls our primate organisms, the primate organisms of our cosmic ecology. Out of their co-evolution emerged atoms and stars and galaxies, all examples of the complex social achievement of actual occasions. The evolution of these physical organisms proves that nature's capacity for emergent value and organizational complexity long predates the arrival of biological cells. These particle and astronomical organisms may be minimally or maximally conscious. The point is that at whatever scale it occurs, information processing is an experiential process, with the intensity of experience depending on the degree of integration of prehended data achieved by any given society of occasions. So if you want to read the rest of the paper, you'll find the link attached.